Thanks to SFU Woodwards and Vancity for making this evening possible. Among those with an affinity for alternative journalism, I think it's fair to call Christian Parenti an icon. He's the author of 4 books. He's traveled the world, writing articles for numerous publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, London Review of Books, Mother Jones, and numerous others. He also has a PhD in sociology, and one thing that impresses me about his work is it always has a strong intellectual underpinning. And he's also a professor at the School for International Training Graduate Institute. And much of Christian's career has been devoted to furthering our understanding of the factors driving state repression. And along the way, he's won numerous journalism awards, and he's also got an Emmy nomination for one of his documentaries. I would suggest that his most important work has been on the topic of climate change. His 2011 book, which I have right here, and I highly recommend, is Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, and it filled me with insights that I'd never previously considered. Who knew, for instance, that climate change created drought conditions in Afghanistan, and that led to the proliferation of poppy growth and opium production? And that was because poppies could be grown with far less water than wheat. So climate change fuels the drug trade. He also explored how climate change and water shortages are contributing to rising tensions between India and Pakistan in Kashmir. And he also links climate change to the intensification of border controls in the age of neoliberal economics. So you can see he takes on serious topics with enormous breadth. Tonight, Christian's lecture is entitled Rethinking the State in the Context of the Climate Crisis. Please give a warm welcome to Christian Parenti.
Thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks to and Jeff for putting this together, and thanks to all of you for coming out. So tonight I'm going to speak to you about sort of where my work is going currently after Tropic of Chaos, sort of how my thinking about climate change has picked up where it left off in this book. And so my whole intellectual career has been about thinking about the state, frequently critiquing it, and I'm now focusing on the state as a potential solution or partial solution to some of the problems that we face. So maybe I'm atoning for my years of criticizing the state and trying to salvage the concept to some extent. And this is motivated in part by the fact that I think the left in the U.S., probably less so in Canada, really has a hard time thinking about the state. So climate change is already calling forth the state, and it's going to do that more and more, and that's going to require that progressives rethink the state and come up with ideas and strategies for engaging with an increasingly important role that the state is going to have in economic and social life. And I think that it's inevitable that the state is called forth by climate change. How it returns is an open question. Whether its return will mean more repression, more inequality, more class segregation, or whether it will mean a return of planning and some economic redistribution and trying to address the underlying problems, these are open questions. But its return, I think, is pretty inevitable. And we can already see this in the extreme weather events that are part and parcel of climate change. So, just so you're aware, in the U.S. in the last 2 years, we've had 25 specific disasters that have been over $1 billion in costs, and the total cost for extreme weather-related disasters in the U.S. over the last 2 years now, $188 billion. And a lot of these are actual costs in the strict economic sense of the word, like a loss of existing wealth rather than a transfer from one party to another, like the destruction of existing infrastructure. So part of the problem in rethinking the state is the legacy of neoliberal ideology, which has been dominant in most of the West since the early 80s or late 70s. And this has been the intellectual project of Hayek coming out of the late 30s, and it's underwritten intellectually the rise of the modern right-wing think tank movement, and it has traction now across the political spectrum. The idea that the state is not useful for anything, that it's not important, that it can be ignored, that it's withering, that it's going away, that it should go away. All these ideas you find actually have traction across the political spectrum. But in reality, neoliberalism, that is to say the shift from Keynesian sort of, regulatory capitalism that used demand management and counter-cyclical economic spending to revive accumulation, the shift from that to a more hardcore right-wing set of economic ideas focused on deregulation and tax cuts, liberalization, that change has not corresponded with a diminishment in the size of the state, of the capitalist state in the core economies at all, actually. And in most of the OECD countries, the state has either maintained its share of the national proportion of the national economy or even grown. So across the OECD, the public sector averages at about 42% of the economy. It's very big. And this is a point that the right loves to harp on because they want to, cut the state. In the words of Grover Norquist, the American anti-tax zealot, he says, he doesn't want to eliminate the state completely. He just wants to reduce it to the size where it can be drowned in a bathtub. But in reality, what neoliberalism has done is merely reshaped the state. So we have less public housing, more publicly funded prisons, an attack on public school teachers, an expansion of the ranks of prison guards, and on like this. So there's no diminishment of the state. There's a qualitative transformation of it to a more repressive, more right-wing project that serves the immediate interests of economic elites better than the social democratic compromise that came out of the Great Depression and World War II did. So the state has not gone away. And when extreme weather associated with climate change comes along, we can see that the state has to step up. And when it doesn't, there are major problems. So we had in New York, the example of Bloomberg's first major snowstorm. This is several years back. And he was attacking the unions. And during the snowstorm, the sanitation workers seemed to be sort of on strike. And again, this was one of these things where the right made much of this and progressives didn't really respond. But, maybe they were on strike. And if they were, more power to them, because they didn't really show up and the city was stranded in snow, and it became suddenly very obvious that public workers, sanitation workers, are actually really essential to the functioning of the city at every level. For capitalism and for people in general, and that if you withdraw the public workforce, the city doesn't function. And so that put the lie to the rhetoric about how the public sector is bloated, how it doesn't do anything, how it's inefficient, how all these union sanitation workers just have sinecures and are overpaid and unessential. And so the next time there was a major storm, Bloomberg was on top of it. And when Hurricane Irene arrived, which wasn't even a hurricane by the time it arrived in New York and New England, and dumped a lot of rain, flooded out the subways to some extent, and Bloomberg prepared, got the trains out of the way, and the state was mobilized because not for some political ideological shift, but because the practicalities of the situation required that government take action. And you see this all across the landscape during these disasters. There's, in the heart of the kind of libertarian anti-state politics of the South, in Georgia and Alabama, where there's been these ice storms. At first, Atlanta was ground to a halt because the state was totally unprepared. Then the state had to mobilize and plan and prepare. The federal government has declared a state of emergency. Similarly, in California, the state has to step in. So the state is coming back and How it comes back is the question. And I think that progressives need to start rethinking the state to facilitate a better form of its return. So later on, I'm going to sort of explain how the state can address the climate crisis. But before that, I'll tell you sort of where my latest project is. So I could have began where this book left off, thinking about, okay, so if this is a new role for the state has to step up. Let's look into this. And it turns out it's not a new role for the state to manage the economy's relationship to nature. For the state, for the capitalist state, to step in and manage the relationship between capital and nature is, in fact, at the heart of what the capitalist state has always done, particularly in the United States. So this also requires that we rethink the concept of nature to some extent, which I think is a highly problematic, uninterrogated concept that circulates among environmentalists, that sort of there's a nature-society distinction. Nature is good, civilization is bad, nature is pure and takes care of itself, has this kind of internal coherence and balance. And if you accept that distinction that takes human beings out of nature and doesn't see civilization as part of nature, then the implied solution is a retreat. And this is the classic view of nature that we've inherited from the West and really from capitalism. It's one of the best things written about this, I think, is William Cronin's now somewhat dated but still great essay called The Trouble with Wilderness, where he really traces the origins of this idea of nature as other and outside of human civilization from biblical notions of nature through the romantics, the sort of the romantic notion of the sublime, into the present and the notion of wilderness, and how really in a way debilitating that is in terms of thinking about solutions to the environmental crisis, because the implication is that if nature is this good, pristine thing that we have intruded upon, then the solution is we have to leave. And that is inadequate in many ways. So looking at the state and nature, I started by digging into Marx's, or really the secondary literature of sort of environmental Marxists, people like John Bellamy Foster, Michael Perlman, Neil Smith, who Jeff and I studied with. And over the last 30 years, scholars have sort of excavated Marx's writing about nature and assembled it into something of a coherent theory of nature and production, which one can take or leave. I think it makes a lot of sense. And so Marx inherits from classical political economy, from Smith and Ricardo, the labor theory of value. Smith, in the beginning of The Wealth of Nations, is trying to figure out why do commodities have prices, things. He doesn't mean sort of, commodities like wheat, but, produced, manufactured things. Why do they have prices? What do these prices reflect? They reflect the labor embodied in them, the direct labor and plus the embedded labor in the tools and the materials that went into them. And Marx inherits this and is more associated with the labor theory of value than classical political economy is. But actually, Marx is very clear that labor is not the only source of value, that nature, non-human nature, is also a source of value, and that in fact human beings are part of nature, that labor power is this category that's very much outside of and pre-existing to capitalist social relations. Labor power is simply the capacities of the human body that are delivered in the labor process when the capitalist buys the workers' labor time, and what the laborer delivers is their labor power, which is really part of nature. And so he says several times, it's not only labor that creates value, it's also nature. And gives the examples of sort of the motive force of waterfalls, the structural strength of wood, all of these ways that nature contributes to economic value. There is also a very rich literature, a sort of non-Marxist literature about how nature produces value as part of where economic wealth comes from. It's obvious, right, to anyone who's looking at reality. So then let's think, okay, so if nature is crucial to the production of value, and this whole system, which is bent on growth at all costs, is about the accumulation of economic value, what is it that delivers nature's use values, nature's utilities, like the structural strength of wood, the nourishment of potatoes, the motive power of waterfalls? What is it that delivers that to production? Well, to answer that, you have to sort of ask the basic question, well, where is nature exactly? It's on the surface of the earth. What institutions control the surface of the earth, ultimately? And ultimately, in the modern era, it's states. Behind any private or personal property stands the power of states. And states are inherently territorial entities. Sort of the classic definition of a state accepted across the political spectrum is it's an institution that has sort of a compulsory political institution that has the monopoly on, not the use of violence, but the monopoly on the use of legitimate violence within a given territory. And so from that relationship between this monopoly on legitimate violence and fixed boundaries comes state power, from which flows all sorts of other powers that frequently get overlooked, one of them being the creation of property regimes. So property regimes and property rights are delivered by the state's sort of central violent component. And so that's one way in which the state delivers nature and its use values to production, through the creation of these property regimes. The other way is through the production of infrastructure that capital, business, private investors can't create on their own because they can't manage to coordinate, or because there are simply certain pieces of infrastructure that can't actually function profitably. They have to function at a loss, and the whole system needs them, and so they have to be paid for somehow. So these are the two basic functions that the capitalist state uses to deliver nature to production. And so I then proceed to look at, this is the book I'm in the middle of writing right now, so I hope you will help me with good suggestions and critiques of my thinking. I've learned to trust audiences, particularly in Vancouver, for having good ideas. So then I'm looking at if the solution to the climate crisis is that the state is coming back, we have to become more conscious of its role in the economy. We have to become active agents in shaping how it returns. Then what's the history of this moment? So in the United States, it's really clear that this is not a new role. This is essentially how American capitalism has developed, that the state, the federal government and states, have from the beginning delivered nature to capital for production. And this is not a simple kind of giveaway. I'm not making a moral point here. We can all, that's an important point to make, that the state gives away nature to capital and lets capital despoil nature. But that there's actually a very important and sophisticated relationship whereby the state opens nature to exploitation for capital. And it does this by building canals, by surveying the land, by funding scientific operations that can open nature, non-human nature, to analysis that is then useful to industry, so geology, biology, government funds all of this. And in the beginning of American history, and I apologize for this being very, south of the border here, but in the beginning of after the Revolution, there's a sort of struggle within American politics around precisely this question. What will the role of government be in managing the economy? And you sort of have two poles. You've got the states' rights element, which coalesces around Jefferson, who is much vaunted, and I think very unjustly treated as some sort of father of democracy. He's highly problematic, but I can get into that later. And then on the other pole was Hamilton, who is associated with the sort of manufacturing and banking interests in New York, and he's seen as the bad guy because he wanted to build capitalism, essentially. And Hamilton wanted to create a strong federal government, public finance, and use the power of government to plan the development of the economy. His concern was that the United States had political and military independence from the British, but that if it didn't develop its economy, it would remain a colony. And actually, a lot of the there's a little caveat here, a lot of the developmentalist thinking associated with Frederick List and later economists and sort of the whole developmentalist project in Asia, the sort of the rise of the tiger economies like South Korea that really use this idea that the state guides the development of capitalism. Capitalism can't develop without the state. A lot of that actually goes back originally to Hamilton through Frederick List, a German economist who lived in the U.S. when a lot of this was going on. So there's this struggle. Should there be a strong government that plans the economy, or should there be weak government and allow states to have their states' rights? And Jefferson is the champion of states' rights, and he does it by making claims about democracy and making claims about authenticity. He's one of the richest presidents the United States ever had. He is a major slave owner sitting on his plantation, surrounded by slaves, where he has a factory that makes nails worked by the children of slaves, writing about how we don't need manufacturing in the United States. We don't need a strong central government. That democracy is best embodied in the yeoman farmer, the character of the yeoman farmer. So we should seek to have an agricultural economy because this is the kind of true and pure and good way that will produce a type of character that's conducive to democracy. And it's really dissembling. And everyone associated with that states' rights school is ultimately afraid of losing their power and privilege and slaves. And occasionally they say it. They'll say, look, if we let the federal government build canals, next they'll be emancipating slaves, which eventually they did. So I'm tracing this history through, the production of the Erie Canal, the rise of the railroads, all of these pieces of economic infrastructure, which are also at the same time a transformation in the social nature of the continental U.S. So let's get back to this concept of nature. If we reject or leave behind the idea that nature is this pristine thing that we have intruded upon, and we start historically thinking about how human beings and human societies have been involved with non-human nature and have in fact shaped it profoundly, we have a very different set of political possibilities that are open. And this is clearly the case. You have, first of all, when European settlers arrived in the Americas, they did not find some sort of pristine nature. They found a landscape that was intensely managed by the civilizations that were already there. On the east coast of the U.S., the main method, it didn't really extend that far into Canada because there's conifers there and that created problems, but sort of south of New England and in southern New England, burning. And the landscape that was described by settlers sounds fanciful, but environmental historians think that it was actually quite accurate. These sort of huge hardwoods surrounded by open areas. You could ride horses through these forests. There were like buffalo came as far east as Georgia. How would that happen, that bison could come that far east? Well, it's because these forests were open and there was much more edge habitat. And that was created by burning. The prairies also pushed much further east than one would suspect, and that was also the result of burning. So First Nations, to use the Canadian term that we should pick up in the south of the border, managed the landscape very intensely. So the type of species that were there, the whole look of the place was not natural in the sense that it existed before human beings or without human beings. It was very much the product of human civilization's engagement with it. And what Native Americans did in many cases was, instead of domesticating animals, they domesticated the landscape and essentially managed a kind of game park. And that was their method of creating what our deceased mentor, the Neil Smith, who Jeff and I studied with, referred to as social nature. And you can also see this in sort of less positive ways everywhere. The Mediterranean, it's now turning out. This landscape, the famous Mediterranean diet, which is essentially an adaptation to this arid landscape, that's all the product of, unfortunately, very bad land management practices. Erosion caused by 8,000 years of civilization created a kind of desiccated Mediterranean that we know and love. Similarly, and that's a type of social nature, and it functions to some extent up until recently. Similarly, in Peru and China, where you have terrace agriculture, where people have been farming sustainably for 800, 1,000 years, you have these intensely managed landscapes. They're very rich, there's biodiversity, but it's not nature in some sort of prelapsarian sense. It's social nature. It's very old, and it's like the role of human beings and the ideas that human beings bring to their practices are crucial to it. So another writer that's influencing me a lot in this is Jason Moore, who's a young scholar, and he's got 2 books coming out soon, and he's got a bunch of articles that you can find on the web. And he takes this tradition of sort of rethinking nature and rethinking capitalism from a Marxist perspective to a new level, I think. And he argues, he says, capitalism doesn't have a relationship to nature. It is a relationship to nature. A highly problematic relationship to nature. And so too is the capitalist state. It doesn't have a relationship to nature. It is a relationship to nature. Because of its territoriality, that is essentially what capitalist states. One of their core functions is to manage nature for production, which is to say, producing social nature. So the Erie Canal is opened. This is not a private venture. This is a public venture. There's a whole experimentation of how to build internal improvements with private investment. It doesn't work. So finally, there's a mobilization of public capital and management, and you get the Erie Canal and opens the whole old Northwest, what we now call, the Midwest and the Great Lakes. And you could see this as, just an intrusion on pure nature. But really what it was a revolution in the social nature. So the Iroquois are pushed out of New York. The burning practices decline, and you get a new set of practices that transform the social nature of the region. And on that story goes, not always with positive effects for species or people, but sometimes with positive effects for species or people. So why make these abstract historical points? Because I actually think it's really important for us to rethink this whole idea of nature and to question the idea that is essentially souped-up conservationism, that the solution is to retreat. I don't think that is sufficient in the face of the climate crisis. And I haven't gone into the sort of basic science of that. I've spoken about that here before, but suffice it to say the crisis is such that a retreat is insufficient, and there has to be a kind of some sort of very, very different engagement with our role as creators of social nature. We can get into that later. So, getting back to the present then. All right, so, how does the state create this problem? How does the state manage social nature? Well, it gives the fossil fuel industry the right to exist. That's the fundamental beginning problem. It heavily subsidizes the fossil fuel industry. And it could do the opposite, and in fact has at its disposal all the tools necessary to do that. So in the United States, the public sector is, the federal government actually is 38%, the federal and state governments, not double counting the money that the federal government gives to states, excluding that, counting that only once, is 38% of GDP. That's an enormous amount of the economy. The left in the U.S. very rarely thinks about this or makes a point of this. The right harps on it constantly so that they can privatize public schools, cut welfare, et cetera, et cetera. But what if we accepted that fact and thought about what could we do with that? That's amazing. The federal government has 100,000 buildings, most of them huge energy guzzling office buildings. They all have to have power and electricity. The federal government is going to spend money on those buildings. Why not use government procurement, use that big section of the economy to purchase clean energy and clean technology, to drive a transformation of the economy? And a lot could be done with that. So you've got the building fleet. The federal government has over 600,000 vehicles. Okay, a lot of them are military, but a lot of them aren't military. The U.S. Post Office alone has 140,000 vehicles, pretty much all of which travel an average of 18 miles a day and park in the same place every night. absolutely no reason that the vast majority of the postal fleet couldn't be electrified. And if that were done, the cost of clean energy and clean technology would go down, because the producers of clean technology would be able to achieve economies of scale, and they could then close the price gap between clean energy and dirty energy. Along the way, also, we should remove the subsidies. Obama says the fossil fuel industry receives $4 billion in subsidies a year. And he says this every year in the State of the Union address and then really does nothing about it, but he brings it up every year. Some people say it's upwards of 10 or 20 billion, but let's say it's $4 billion a year. That's a lot. So closing the price gap between clean energy and dirty energy. The other thing in sort of the history of technology development that becomes apparent is that there's generally lots of money for innovation, experimentation, and once a technology has come to market and has proven itself in the market, there's generally a lot of investment to, pile in at the end. But in the middle, there's what technology developers call the valley of death, where it's hard to get the investment needed to bring technology to scale. Most of the technology that in the U.S. context has really crossed that valley of death has done so in large part due to not so much government subsidy, though that's part of it, but through government consumption of these technologies. And this is like the key thing that government could do immediately without passing new laws, is to consume the products that are currently too expensive for the private sector to sell to the public. So electric vehicles, clean power, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how the aircraft industry developed. This is how computers developed. IBM, for the first 2 decades of its existence, more than half of its sales went to the federal government. Similarly, the airlines were subsidized to carry the U.S. mails until they could develop the technology enough to actually compete on the open market against other forms of transportation. Unfortunately, a lot of how the capitalist state in the West exercises its sort of secret socialist function of planning and subsidy is through warfare and through the military budget. And you get these sort of accelerated cycles of innovation and production and consumption, because war is, along with killing people, it's fundamentally about destroying things that then have to be replaced. And so clearing out these, circuits of accumulation means that war is sort of like the hothouse phase of development for technology. And that's unfortunate. But we can see in this history the crucial, undeniable role of states, of capitalist states, in creating capitalism by managing nature and by essentially, guiding the development of technology. And the means to do that with clean technology are available to us. Another important thing that government in the U.S., and I'm sure it's similar but different here in Canada, is to essentially, put a price on carbon. This is what economists across the spectrum say would be the best thing for building out clean technology. Luckily, we don't actually need to pass legislation to do that in the U.S., and that was one of the tragedies of the Obama administration's first 2 years, is there was this whole struggle to get what would have really been bad legislation passed, comprehensive climate legislation. We have what environmentalists in the U.S., many of them consider to be some of the strongest environmental laws in the world. The problem is they're just not enforced that much. But we have the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. These were all passed under Richard Nixon, not a progressive person by any means, but he was forced to do so by massive protest movements. Earth Day at that time was the biggest demonstration the world had seen. And part of what motivated people to get in the environmental movement in the late 60s and early 70s was the local level crisis of pollution. Dead rivers, unbreathable air. Even in New York City in the late 60s, people would die when there would be sort of smog events, thermal inversions, and the pollution would just sit. And it was in response to that the EPA was created and all these laws were passed. And the laws were written to be pretty broad and pretty aggressive. And the fact of the matter is the Endangered Species Act, for example, is like, it is the version of the law that Rush Limbaugh and these crazy right-wingers say it is. And I think that's great. And I'm relying here on the work, the pioneering work of the Center for Biological Diversity, which was started by a bunch of Earth Firsters who were sort of, monkey-wrenching activists who started looking into the nature of U.S., particularly federal environmental law, and they realized, wait a minute, we can essentially monkey-wrench projects that we don't like. We can essentially sabotage projects we don't like with lawsuits pursuant to these federal laws. And they've been remarkably successful in doing that. And they do stuff like, hold up the development of power plants in the name of some totally uncharismatic little weed that happens to be an endangered species, And this drives the right totally berserk. They're trying to stop progress in the name of weeds. It's like, yeah, not just the weeds, everything else as well. But so after when the federal government, when the Clinton administration signed the Kyoto Protocol, which is the first international agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it couldn't get this law ratified by the Senate because the Senate has to ratify international treaties according to the U.S. Constitution. So we were not a party to it. So then some states and environmental groups sued the federal government in a case that became known as Massachusetts versus EPA. And this was in the courts for 10 years. And in 2007, one of the most right-wing Supreme Courts we've had in a long time said, yes, in fact, the states are correct and the federal government is wrong. And the state's argument was that according to the Clean Air Act, the federal government had to regulate greenhouse gas emissions because they were harmful to human health. And if emissions are dangerous to human health, then the federal government the EPA under the Clean Air Act has to regulate them. Not is free to, can if it wants, has to regulate them to make the danger go away. If you pushed that law to its furthest logical conclusion, is all you need to shut down the fossil fuel industry. The Bush administration did nothing about this. The Obama administration came in and said that it would follow the law, and it basically hasn't. And we're waiting for, more than 20 rules pursuant to this for how this should be interpreted as regards, interstate trucking, oil refineries, cement plants, the whole economy should be given new emissions targets based on the Clean Air Act as amended by Massachusetts versus EPA. So Obama has done nothing about that except issue new rules about automobile emissions, which was fairly easy to do because there was already a type of mileage rules that weren't about the emissions, they were about the mileage, but indirectly they added up to emissions rules. So people were used to having automobile mileage regulated. And then finally, he allowed the EPA to issue rules for new coal-fired power plants. And so what was going on was actually, no, I'm sorry, it was not new plants, it was existing plants. And what was going on in that case was that this was easy politics because I'm suddenly forgetting which one it was. Oh my God, I can't believe that. Anyway, one of these. The politics of what this was that natural gas had come online from fracking and the price of natural gas had dropped by like 80%. And in a lot of coal-fired power plants, it's very easy to retrofit them to burn natural gas. And so nobody was going to build new coal-fired power plants. It was the new, I'm pretty sure. And so this was easy to set stringent emissions rules because it wasn't actually going to cause much trouble to the utility industry. So if the federal government did this, followed the law, and imposed these rules on the economy, they could essentially impose a de facto carbon tax. It would mean that industry was free to burn fossil fuels, but it would have to pay major fines, and those fines would then essentially wipe out the profitability of fossil fuels. That, coupled with acting as the major first-generation consumer of clean technology, would close the price gap, provide funding, create economies of scale, and really push us towards where we need to go, which is a precipitous, radical decline in greenhouse gas emissions starting, 10 years ago, starting immediately. Like 90% reduction by the middle of the century is sort of the minimum. So all of this is doable. The money is there. We have the technology. there's plenty of money to do this, and we actually have the laws, all within the largest economy in the world. So then the question becomes, politically, why aren't we doing this? And obviously we have to have movements that create a crisis that force the political class to do this. Now, I know that this will sound rather reformist to a lot of my comrades, and it is to some extent, but I think that in thinking seriously about the climate crisis, we need to be clear about short-term goals and long-term goals. And the climate science is such that we do not have the time to totally transform all social relations and then build a new energy sector. Nor does history indicate that transforming all social relations and having some sort of a revolution and moving to some sort of post-capitalist economy necessarily translates into getting off of fossil fuels. So to say that capitalism can get off fossil fuels and lay out how it could is not to say that capitalism is sustainable or could be. That's a different question. I don't think it is sustainable. I mean, it's not, not every single beach in the world can be turned into a sandals resort, right? Not every tree can be cut down. The system can grow infinitely. The planet is finite. But this climate science is such that we do have to basically buy time to deal with other problems by, getting these institutions and this society as it's currently configured to start dealing immediately with reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that is not a utopian or impossible project. It is absolutely doable. And that's what I'm trying to explain here. Nor does it constitute really a new role for the state. It is really one of the core functions of the state recognized, and the state's role in managing nature for production or creating social nature will only change if we're conscious of this history and conscious of what the state is and does and therefore can do. And if we succumb to the myths of neoliberalism that the state is in decline, that it should be in decline, or whatever, that it's not essential, we deny ourselves a reservoir of existing resources and power, which is the public sector, a lot of which has been produced by struggle, and progressives should own and try and continue to guide the public sector. I think own in a sort of metaphorical sense. And there's some movement in this direction. So recently, 8 states in the U.S., California, New York, Rhode Island, Connecticut, Vermont, some other states, I forget which ones, but the key ones are really California, New York, but very much California, have agreed to start purchasing electric vehicles. And their main goal is to create charging infrastructure that will be open to the public at large. And they realize that government plays this role with all technology, and it has to be done around clean technology. So the federal government won't do anything, but these are key states. They've already been instrumental in sort of coming together to push other emissions, somewhat successful emissions programs around acid rain and stuff like that. So some things are happening, but really environmentalists generally don't make these kinds of demands of the state. They don't articulate the role of the state. We don't think about this. Or if we do it through this, I think, very flawed and dangerous version of nature in which we and civilization are bad and it is good and the solution is to retreat. And that doesn't ultimately appeal to people that much when push comes to shove. And then it doesn't do that much because it leaves untransformed the process of production. And that's what has to change. Not just the footprint and where there are roads, but what goes down those roads. What's the power system? So what I'm suggesting is that the left broadly, the environmental movement internationally, really, I think, could benefit from rethinking the state and also rethinking nature, and rethinking the relationship between the state and nature. Now, how exactly that would happen is a question that can only be answered by real people in real places through the actual practice and struggle of these movements. And I have faith that we can do this. So I think I have gone on long enough, and that we should hand it over to the panel and to you guys. So thanks a lot.
You're in the second one. I want to thank Christian for a very thought-provoking and surprising presentation and embrace the state. I'm Charlie Smith from the Georgia Strait, and we're going to have a discussion with a panel, and then we'll invite questions from the audience. There will be two people going up, one up this aisle and one up this aisle, so you'll have a chance to ask Christian some questions yourself. First, I'm going to introduce the panelists. On my far left is Kai Nagata, and Kai is a journalist. He's worked for CBC, CTV, Desmog Blog, Tai, and numerous other publications. Tara Mahoney is a PhD student in communications at SFU. She's also the creative director of Gen Y Media, and it's an organization that promotes civic engagement among young people. And joining us on Skype from Victoria is Melina Labukan Massimo. And Melina is an advocate for Indigenous rights and a member of the Lubicon Cree First Nation. And she's an environmental activist, and she's worked and studied in numerous countries. So she'll be joining us from Skype, and I'll just simply be the wagon master here. So I'll start with Kai. Do you have a question for Christian? And you can pick up the microphone there.
Sure, and thank you very much for that thought-provoking intro. One of the organizations that's been most aggressive in mandating cleaner energy use is the U.S. military, which has a huge procurement budget. And when the Marine Corps decides we're going to use 20% less gasoline, it just happens because they don't want their supply chains cut off. They don't want that kind of vulnerability. The question is, would it be easier to achieve the transition that you're describing if we got rid of elections and just let the generals have a little bit more say?
Well, obviously, I'm not in favor of getting rid of elections, and if you let the generals have their say, they would do many other things other than get off fossil fuels. But yeah, I mean, this is, your question points at one of the contradictions of particularly American capitalism, which is, we don't have industrial policy in Europe and to some extent here in Japan. Their industrial policy exists and is legitimate. And in the U.S., we have to smuggle industrial policy in through the military budget. And that's where experimentation and planning is done. That's where the technology sector gets incubated. And it's totally unfortunate and horrible that that's the way it is. And the military budget has to be cut, and we have to, really try and rein in U.S. militarism. But it is good that the military is experimenting with, or not experimenting, is adopting these clean technologies. I wish that the rest of the government would do that as well.
Tara?
So my question is about, so when you're talking about kind of bringing the state back or reimagining the state, and you sort of alluded to, movements, what's the role of the citizen, in your thesis? So, and especially in a time of, democratic repression that we're experiencing here and is being experienced all around the world, how do you make that political transition when the avenues to politics are being aggressively blocked?
Well, I think it's through building movements that challenge power and challenge the state and create a crises or various crises of legitimacy for the political class that they can only solve and respond to and buy back their legitimacy, some of their legitimacy with concessions, So a movement that's strong enough to make demands that can't be ignored, that have to be answered, whether they are answered by politicians that care and get it, or whether they are answered by politicians that simply want to stay in office and agree to, eliminating subsidies for fossil fuels, is really secondary to basically getting the political class to step away from capital to some extent, right? I mean, part of how the capitalist state reproduces capitalism is by having some autonomy from the capitalist class, occasionally having to do things that individual capitalists don't like, right? I mean, like taxation, right? None of them like that. They all need it. And it's not done because they agree to it. It's done because it has to be done, and they consistently resist it. So too all of these regulations that they're constantly pushing against. Sometimes, we've had so many defeats that we can forget how constrained capital feels. Every single dollar they have to spend on environmental remediation is a dollar too much, but they have to do it anyway. And they have to do it because movements in the past and movements currently and policy advocates, police them to some extent and force the political class to discipline capital in ways that individual captains of industry don't like but have to do. So I think movements have to basically create a crisis that can only be solved with real fundamental change.
I'm going to...
Sorry, I just want a quick follow-up question. So how do you define, crisis? Is that, what would be an example? Would that be a violent crisis? Because I know, in Canada, the Idle No More movement, and Melina will be able to speak to this more, but they, engaged in blockades and that kind of thing. And basically what it results in is just they bring in the military and they quash it with violence. So is it more of that, or is it more subversive cultural tactics, or I'm trying to think of what it would be in a place like Canada where you don't have a lot of civic engagement, especially at the federal level, and you don't really have a population who's going to go out on the streets and blockade or that kind of thing. So,
well, I mean, I don't have a set of a tactical menu or strategic menu. I mean, I think I have this broad strategic argument about the importance of the state, but the people have to work that out through practice. In terms of what has worked in American history, it's I don't think that violence is particularly useful when you're up against the American state because it has all the guns and all the surveillance and has a long history of rolling up movements in the name of fighting terrorism and violence. So that invites a kind of repression. This is the history of, the Black Panthers and many of the other movements of the 60s, the sort of radical environmental movement, like ELF. I mean, just turning to, and we can have this whole discussion about what's violence, is burning SUVs violence? No, it's not violence. But that's an invitation to the most powerful, most repressive state in the world coming in and arresting people on conspiracy charges. So I don't think I'm not making a moral point, I'm making a tactical point. I don't think that's the way to go. But mass movements in the past have done a lot. I mean, why did women get the right to vote in the U.S.? Because suffragettes organized and demanded it and did really intense stuff and suffered a lot and went to prison and created a real crisis that could only be solved and only be gotten rid of with the concession of the vote. The suffragettes actually in the UK did get violent sometimes. They bombed Parliament twice, actually. Okay. Nobody was injured, though. So maybe it wasn't violent. I don't know.
I'm going to add a little more information about Melina. She's also worked for the past 6 years on tar sands extraction issues as a climate and energy campaigner with Greenpeace in Alberta. And she's finishing her master's degree in Indigenous governance at the University of Victoria. So, Melina, you have the floor. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. How can everybody hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, well, thank you for having me. It's nice to be here, and I wish I could see everybody in person, but I'm stuck over here trying to go to class first thing in the morning. But it's nice to be on the panel, and it's great to hear Christian's talk. And I guess my question would be more related to kind of how states are dealing with climate change internationally. From my experience, what I've witnessed and observed attending, say, the UNFCCC, the UN Climate Change Forum, where states are coming together to deal with the issue of climate change, and how, Christian had mentioned the Kyoto Protocol and how, and also the failure of that, how Canada's, since reneged on the binding agreement that they had at the time, and now states are going back to the drawing board and doing this again through the UNFCCC. And what I've noticed being there and to kind of how people are dealing with it on the ground is that a lot of the solutions that are being put forward by states through the UNFCCC are REDS programs, which sounds really nice because it sounds like reduction to deforestation and degradation, but what it actually is a market-based mechanism to basically deal with climate change and commodify air and these carbon offsets. And I think there's some good literature out there about how the REDS systems have already been problematic in other places around the world, especially namely indigenous peoples, because what it's doing is allowing for carbon offsets to companies to potentially buy carbon offsets, but then buying out kind of forests where indigenous peoples are living or forest dwelling peoples live, and basically kind of new land grabbing. And as you know, with kind of the big state paradigm that Christian is mentioning, for Indigenous peoples, there's 370 Indigenous peoples around the world living within 70 different states, and there's a very problematic issue with that in itself because of colonialism and the history of colonialism. And I think that's very much related to capitalism and its interaction with nature, and kind of horrible failings of capitalism with its relationship with nature, because it's a profit-based system. And Indigenous peoples definitely have a different way of viewing the system. And I definitely agree with Christian in the sense that, the way that North America, or what we call Turtle Island, was before Europeans came over, was that it was actually very well managed. We had indigenous economies, we had a social economy, we had mixed economies where these are actually very much related to our governance systems. And so the land everywhere, and that's why we say traditional territories, is because it was very much governed in relationship to the land, not as kind of opposing force upon the land. And that's what we see happening with neocolonialism. So my question for Christian is, because you're basically pushing for a state kind of based solutions potentially to deal with climate change, do you think that the UNFCCC or the market-based mechanisms that we're seeing put forward through, say, the RED system is the best way forward and the best way to let states determine how to reduce their carbon emissions to deal with climate change?
No, I don't. And I mean, I think like the UNFCCC process is clearly broken down, and where we do see some positive change is at the national level. So you have in Spain last year, the single largest source of energy entering the grid at any time throughout the year was wind, and Germany through its feed-in tariff law, which allows anyone not just to put energy into the grid or bank energy into the grid, but to sell energy into the grid, has led to this massive build-out in renewable energy. And so at the level of nation states, there are policies that are bringing down the price of clean energy and bringing into focus the real possibility of getting beyond fossil fuels. The international process around climate change is riven with all of the power imbalances and problems of the international state system, which has been one of the realms in which people misrecognize the state. They think that, they look at imperialism and how strong core economies with big militaries go and abrogate the rights of small states, and they say, oh, see, the nation state doesn't really apply anymore. But the international state system has always involved strong states and weak states, and strong states bully and control and invade and dominate the weak states. That doesn't mean the state as such is weakening. You can read it just the opposite. It shows you how strong states are the crucial vehicles for capital. So this international process has been hostage to the power of these powerful states at the core of the world economy, and they're not honest brokers in this regard. So it's good that activists put pressure on those negotiations, but I mean that's not going to be the place at which these changes happen. I think it's going to be much more at the nation-state level. So you see in China, for example, China is building out renewable energy pretty quickly, and it's doing it for the same reasons that in the United States we passed the Clean Air Act and created the EPA, because the local crisis of air quality is so extreme that something has to be done. And politicians who get it and sometimes don't get it and don't care have to do stuff to deal with this, because people are actually in rebellion about how filthy the environment is. So what I'm arguing is for action by social movements addressing the state at multiple levels, at the local level, the regional level, the national level, and then those become the questions of rethinking the state. What does that mean? These are the questions that have to be dealt with. How do climate change is going to deliver some sort of relocalization of economies, but so how do different levels of how do movements engage with and control different levels of government? How can you get assistance from one level of government against another level of government? Those are the types of questions that I think we need to think about. But yeah, the international state process, it's highly, highly problematic.
Okay, we'll do one more run through with the panel, and then I'll take some questions from the audience. So Kai?
Sure, thank you. I don't think we're unique in Western Canada in dealing with politicians who think on an electoral time frame instead of a geological time frame. But just to give you an example, our next door neighbors, the province of Alberta, peaked at 40% of their government revenue from oil and gas extraction. And now they find themselves in a deficit. And half of that deficit last year was caused by flooding, a once-in-a-century event that, of course, the state had to step in, and there was some controversy over some confiscated guns in some towns, and there was a lot of interesting interaction between the state and nature for a few weeks, but they came out of it $1 billion in the red. $2 billion if you count all the money they lost because of discounts on their cruddy, low-grade crude oil. So now they're pushing for these pipelines to the West Coast to bump the price of oil so that they can pay for hospitals and schools. And we're very smug in BC because we don't do bitumen. We frack methane and want to put that on tankers on the West Coast. Of course, we need a huge amount of electricity to liquefy that, which is why we're building more hydroelectric dams, but those need glaciers, which again, we're having trouble understanding that the glaciers aren't as productive as they used to be. So how do you deal with politicians whose solutions to these problems are always based on further expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure, and there doesn't seem to be that kind of electoral consequences within a 4-year time frame? What's your advice to citizens in this part of the world dealing with this kind of maddening cyclical logic?
Again, I'm not a strategist of social movements, so I don't know. But it seems like here's a couple things that in observing what movements have done and how they play out. It seemed like when Obama was targeted personally by, when Bill McKibben mobilized about 40,000 people to go to D.C. and targeted Obama and sort of like, what about your kids? That had some effect. He's now at least making noises. It's mostly just noises around climate change. And if these politicians can be humiliated and embarrassed and forced to explain themselves, that might have some effect. And then some of them, have to be voted out of office. And then there's going to be a lot of defeats. It's very hard to beat the money of the fossil fuel industry. One thing that Timothy Mitchell, who's a historian who teaches at Columbia, has a new book out, not that new, but a couple of years, whatever, Carbon Democracy. And he argues it's basically looking at the role of coal and coal miners in the creation of broadly defined sort of political and economic democracy in the West. And the shift from coal to oil is, in his reading of history, very much a shift away from the power of the working class towards the power of the ruling class, because in oil there's very little labor is involved, and you use capital technology instead of labor. And so that shift, which Churchill, interestingly, leads the way by shifting the British Navy off of coal onto oil. He comes straight from fighting coal miners before doing that. That this is very much a strategy about avoiding the power of labor. And he makes a case that in this energy economy where expertise and information is really crucial, that's actually a site of struggle, which I had never thought about before. And I thought that's true. So maybe one way that movements do this already, and it is effective, but that the production of knowledge is important, and the dissemination of knowledge around fracking. Part of how this fracking boom has taken place in the U.S. is the main thing is that fracking was exempted in the 2005 energy bill from any clean air, clean water, EPA regulations. At the time, it was like an experimental technology, and so a lot of people who voted for the energy bill, Congress people, genuinely didn't know what they were approving. That they don't have to disclose the chemicals they use. I mean, they're totally hidden. So if they had to explain what they were doing, if they had to submit to measurement, and if there was an argument made around the fact that they're probably, through this fugitive methane releases, not reducing emissions at all, I mean, that would be important and helpful. But, the answer to all these questions about what should the movement do is sort of like, all of the things that we've already been doing, plus other things. But but I mean, I think that's very important in terms of part of how fracking gets a clean pass is through the secrecy that the government allows. And so one thing Obama said recently, which he should be held to account on, is that these firms will have to disclose what they're putting down into these wells. And currently they don't have to do that. And also they're getting laws passed at the local level preventing people from monitoring the air to try and prove that there's escaped gas and stuff like that. So that's, a site of struggle that already exists. It's not like movements don't do that. But I think that Timothy Mitchell has a good point about the nature of capital and knowledge in relation to the fossil fuel industry as a kind of a shield protecting it. And the struggle around science and knowledge production is key. He uses, I understand that a relative of Keeling, the scientist who first measured CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere out in Hawaii and created what's known as the Keeling curve, the measurement of how CO2 concentrations go up and down, but generally go up. He had to fight battles again and again and again just to get funding and just to get the right to sort of do this science. And elements of the government under pressure from the fossil fuel industry tried to sort of prevent the creation of that knowledge. And that graph, those facts are tremendously powerful to the extent we have any traction around climate change and people care. Like those kinds of interventions are really important.
I have a very quick follow-up. There was a court decision today in Nebraska. A judge decided that the governor of Nebraska actually broke the law in approving the routing of the Keystone XL pipeline. And the people bringing the challenge are these libertarian ranchers in the Sand Hills who took the state to court, and now they look like they're the people who, I mean, regardless of what you think of the effectiveness of Bill McKibben's tactics, the people that I see actually delaying the Keystone XL pipeline are right-wing, property rights, obsessed libertarian ranchers. Is there something that the left is missing out on?
No, I mean, my understanding is that the coalition against the Keystone XL has always involved these kinds of local alliances, and I mean that's what effective social movements often involve, right? Alliances of convenience. You don't have to agree on everything, but if you both don't want the pipeline, then that's good enough for fighting the pipeline.
Tara?
I was wondering around. So if we look to the state to help us solve some of these problems, do we then how do you think about the way that the state is currently structured? So do we accept that it's going to be this centralized hierarchical bureaucracy still? Or is the state something else? Like, is it something more creative and inspiring and participatory?
Well, first of all, I don't like the language of look to the state, right? It's not about looking to the state. It's about making demands of the state, taking possession of the state, right? And using it, as has been done in the past, right? Why did segregation end in the South? Not because white elites in the South decided they should end it, but because the federal government came in and imposed federal law on them against their will. And the Kennedy administration did that because it was being humiliated internationally by the civil rights movement. And it was international concerns. It was like, Kennedy his real passion was fighting communism. And this was getting in the way. Having African-American school kids, berated by racist mobs and having local police sick dogs on protesters played very badly internationally when Africa was decolonizing and the case was being made to join the West's camp rather than the non-aligned movement or, go for Soviet socialism. And this became, people like Bull Connor, these local racists became an international problem. And so the federal government, imposed its power on these locals. So, it's not about like appeals, it's about struggles, it's about conflict, and there are pieces of the state that we can use to force our will upon our enemies, is what I'm talking about, That's really what we're talking about, right? To get off of fossil fuels, what are we talking about? We're talking about, euthanizing one of the most powerful industries that have ever existed. The only other comparable thing that I can think of is the abolition of slavery, which basically wrote off about 25 or 20% of the capital stock, quote unquote, in the U.S., or at least in the South. It's like an enormous loss, right? The slave-owning class was never going to agree to that. That wasn't about appeals. That was about the mobilization of constituencies, the gaining of institutional power, and then the imposition of that power upon parties that would not comply voluntarily. And that's how social change has happened often. Child labor ended.
There was
not
a war,
because,
too.
Yeah, I know there was a war.
Hundreds of thousands of people died.
Yeah, which the slaveocracy started, should be pointed out. Child labor didn't end simply through appeals, but through demands and a crisis, and movements that had to be placated with concessions. So that's what I'm talking about. And I think it's part of the question that also becomes part of, the rest of your question is like, we have to transform the state. No, obviously, I've spent my entire intellectual career writing about like prisons and policing and surveillance and war, critiquing the American state in particular. I'm intimately aware of what it is. But it's not only that, and clearly those things, just regardless of climate change, need to be pushed back. They're very, very dangerous and very problematic. So I'm not saying, this state as it is fine, we just get it to solve our problems for us. No. It's not that. It's like, we're looking around for resources. We see what the problem is. We see what the time frame is. What are we going to do? Well, we've got these laws. We've got all this money. It's our money, right? We're talking about like clean purchasing. Well, that's like money that we pay in taxes. Like we can make demands and get some action. And actually, it's beginning a little bit with those 8 states, and there isn't even really that much of it. No one's really demanding that the government take this role. And
actually,
yet
Christine,
8 states.
I'm going to bring Melina in because
Sorry.
You've been sitting here patiently in Victoria, and you have the floor.
Okay. I don't know. Like, I feel like we have been campaigning against the government for a number of years. Coming from Alberta, when we had a massive oil spill in our community, it was, that was the first people that we went to was the government to try to deal with the situation. They've been giving the approvals to the industry, so therefore they should be dealing with kind of, say, maybe an emergency response plan so people aren't breathing the air that my family had to breathe after the massive oil spill happened. So I I feel like the state isn't necessarily listening to us in our concerns, and hasn't been for a number of years, especially as an Indigenous person, because that is an imposed system as well. And so I think there's a lot of people that don't identify with the state and what the state is capable of doing. And I think especially in Alberta, where we already have low environmental standards, what we're seeing is regulatory capture, where big industry and industry work hand in hand. And there's basically a revolving door between government officials and industry in Alberta. And so I guess my question would be is, how do we actually deal with that in the sense that, if the state is corrupt in itself, how do we actually change that?
Well, by, trying to address that as part of the problem and making different demands on the state.
But we have been doing that.
Yeah, I know. But the thing is, the problem that, I think we face is that to, be defeated isn't on any front, right, isn't justification for giving up, right? So what we have in the U.S. is a lot of the sort of the left as it currently is, though valiant and brave and creative, I think turns their impotence into a virtue, which is that, okay, we can't get the state to make concessions. We can't change the laws. We can't make the kinds of gains that the labor movement and the women's movement and the civil rights movement made in the past. So we're going to do an end run around the state. We're going to theorize that it doesn't actually exist, that it's going away, that it's not even real. We're going to imagine a kind of a path to a stateless society that doesn't involve confronting the state or capital. And I think that is highly problematic, because I don't think that works either. And actually, if you look at, I don't want to beat up on horizontalism or something. So I'm saying this, out of a spirit of respect and concern. But if you look at the record of horizontalism, there's not that much there in terms of victories, And you look at the record of the left in the West that has tried to shape the state, it has achieved some pretty important things, like the creation of public schools, like the creation of some minimal environmental regulations, which have actually been pretty effective, like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, have had a very positive and profound effect on the local environment in the United States. The creation of Social Security, these are features of the sort of the welfare, the remaining tattered post-neoliberal welfare state in the U.S., such as it is, that are very significant. I mean, Social Security keeps millions of people out of poverty. Those were not gifts from on high, from elites or from the state. Those were concessions made to movements that made demands and created crises that could not otherwise be solved other than through concessions. So the fact that we don't have the strength now to do that, I think, is not an excuse to turn away. And again, it's really interesting. I find this again and again. People have a very hard time thinking about this thing of how would you make demands on the state? How would you use the state? How would you use something that's full of contradictions, right? The state is, on one hand, it's racist prison guards setting up yard fights in Corcoran, California. On the other hand, it's Head Start programs that are run very efficiently and have, really massive positive influences on people's lives. I mean, so the state is full of these contradictions. And it's not about accepting it as it is, but it's about parsing out these different functions, rejecting some of them, trying to, undo and minimize and move away from the repressive functions and build out the progressive functions. And I think that's the core question in terms of its return. The state is going to return. Is it going to be, as it was in New Orleans after Katrina, a bunch of cops? Or is it going to be, as it was in Vermont after Irene, the state government working with local governments, working with communities, where you had this real kind of DIY local self-help and solidarity thing, interacting through town government with the state government, then the state leveraging the federal government to get money to the state. We never could have rebuilt that state without federal government money. It's 621,000 people in Vermont, it was upwards of almost $1 billion of damage. There's no way Vermont could have dealt with that on its own.
Okay, now we're going to go to the audience. It's your turn, and there's a question up here. The gentleman about 2/3 of the way up. And if you could keep the questions concise, we don't have a lot of time left. We're a little bit over time right now. We'll get more content. Thanks.
I'm really interested in some of the comments you made with regards to, local coalitions, alliances that have created the movements. Just from my experience living up in the interior, one of the only example after about 40 years of working on environmental stuff that I have faith in was one based around the Hat Creek large coal deposit. 37 years ago, BC Hydro came to our area and wanted to build a coal plant, sell the electricity to the States, all that kind of stuff. The locals, ranchers, hippies, First Nations got together and we kicked their ass. And have gathered in the spot where there would have been a 450-foot toxic slag heap every year since in order to fight off another 5 or 6 different proposals. Now that we have a situation where over half of the 100 largest economies in the world are corporations, it's mainly corporations, these monoliths that we're dealing with. But what I'm really interested in is further discussions. Some of what you mentioned earlier about regress or this environmental movement, going back instead of latching on to the opportunities of the state. What I'm interested in is whether you would see those local kinds of examples. I see them more as pulling away from the state, really putting our faith in local community consensus kinds of models instead of using that as the foundation of possibly altering the state. But the state and corporations are what we're dealing with.
Well, but it sounds, I don't know the details of this victory. Did you win because the corporation simply decided to go away, or was there a law that said, sorry, you can't do this here? In most cases, they decided to go away. Really? All right, well, that's good. The victory would be more secure if it was illegal for them to do that. So again, I'm not arguing for an appeal to mommy and daddy state, but about using the power of government, which is everywhere all the time, shaping social reality and capitalism constantly, so it's not a new thing, to use that to control capital in the ways that we have to avoid tipping points and climate crisis. So in other words, it's about, just what I said, I think I've been repeating myself. It's about recognizing that popular movements can crystallize their victories and generally have to crystallize their victories in law and not just in sentiment and ideology, right? If it were that alone, there would, a lot of the sort of core victories of the last century wouldn't exist.
So the next question up here.
I don't know if I can, I've been trying to figure out how to articulate this, but it seems to me that money has a lot to do with power, and money has. A lot of us, people have RRSPs and mutual funds, and those are in the tar sands, right? And I remember I had a locked in some money and realized I didn't want to keep it in because everything's in the tar sands. So somebody said, oh, well, their mother's a professor in Philadelphia, and look at what their money is, And so I looked through there, and I went, oh, isn't that interesting? It's, Dick Cheney's company, right? And so that's all sort of doing things too. So it's interesting to look at where money is, right? And because I think that's what a lot of capitalists do, and that's why the oil industry is so big, because it's about making money. So if people get behind the idea of these other ways of making money, right? and that takes off, then you find that capitalism wants to go there because they want to, anyways, that's.
Well, would you like to respond, Christine?
Yeah, what you're sort of saying is one subtext of what you're saying also deals with the divestment thing, so that's something to deal with. But, it's not as simple as sort of leading by a good example. If we show that wind farms are profitable, then ExxonMobil will turn into a wind power corporation. Unfortunately, I don't think that's going to happen. ExxonMobil has the problem of all of this sunk capital, these fixed assets. It's not a stock portfolio, ExxonMobil. It might be in your stock portfolio, but it's not a stock portfolio. It's a collection of real things, right? The wealth is embodied in oil tankers, oil refineries, oil deposits, and that's not so easy to get out of. And that's part of why they're fighting tooth and nail to defend their assets, because it's not just numbers on a sheet that can be moved to another column labeled green. It's real stuff that's going to lose its value, and that's what they're trying to defend. Now, in terms of divestment as a tactic, I wrote a piece that was supportively critical, and a lot of people overreacted, I thought. But a lot of people closer to the movement were very, really took it on board and were really pleasant about it. But in terms of the divestment movement that's going on in the U.S. about getting universities to divest their stock portfolios of fossil fuel assets, I think that's good, but I think we have to recognize the limits of it. And at first, this was being pitched as a way to do economic damage to the oil companies. But the fact of the matter is, oil companies make money by selling oil, not by selling their stock. And the function of the stock market is to take money out of companies, not to put money into companies. The myth that the financial sector tells about itself to legitimize itself is that it is a source of funding for capitalism. It's actually not true. It is a way for the owning class to extract money from firms. Most firms generate money for investment through profits. Occasionally, the stock market is important for startup firms, though look at the point of an IPO like Facebook, what's that about? That's about the original investors cashing out when they sell you the stock and it plunges, whatever. It's since recovered. But and at the end, when firms are in real crisis, sometimes they can get some capital for investment from the stock market. But by and large, firms that sell shares on the market rather than are privately held have lower rates of investment. So there's limits, I think, to how much firms can be affected directly through this divestment. It will create, a spectacle. It will politicize the divestment movement. It will politicize universities, which is good. I mean, there's a long list of reasons why university administrators should be made uncomfortable and have to confront angry and organized students. So what I was arguing is that we have to recognize the limits of this, then we can't pitch it as something more than it is. And I also think there needs to be some secondary demands on the table. So it's like divest your stock portfolio, and also why are you consuming fossil fuels, right? If you're committed to the environment, how can these massive universities justify electrifying their buildings on coal, et cetera? They have the money to buy clean power at a premium. They should be forced to do that by these movements. And I think that given the time frame of the science, those are important demands to have on the table, to try and leverage this purchasing, institutional purchasing, to create a market for clean technology. Because the key thing that the clean tech sector needs isn't investment, it's customers. That's why these companies keep going into crisis and bankruptcy. It's because they have too much investment and not enough revenue coming in, so they can't service the investment. So they're not looking, Gamesa, Vestas, the wind companies, they're not looking desperately for capital to invest. What they need are customers.
We're just going to go a little bit over time, and I want to race through 3 questions. So if we can move along. And then there's a reception also in the World Arts Center afterward. So I'll start with the gentleman up here on the right.
Hi. Am I mic on here? Hi, my name is Michael Goodman. I'm from Smart Change, and we're a social movement building organization. It seems like the obvious answer to what you're talking about is not to beg the state, but to take over the state. And you're talking from a U.S. perspective, and I appreciate that, but we have a very different reality here in British Columbia and in Canada. In so much as that a large percentage of our population sees things very differently than the masters of the controls right now. What we really need to do is get organized with a larger percentage of the population so that we can actually take state control. And you talk about the victories that were made in the United States at different points of the civil rights movement and other movements. Well, think back to the Barrett government in 1972-75, in which a maverick brought in the Agricultural Land Reserve here in British Columbia, hated piece of legislation, jumped all over it. Well, today, the same guy's a hero. So these possibilities can happen here in British Columbia. We're not that far away from having a very different government here in British Columbia. What we need to do is get our shit together and get organized better and bring over a few percentage more of the population to our point of view. For those of you who think I'm just dreaming, about 6,000 votes was the difference between the Conservative
Party. Is there a question here now?
There's coming a question.
Okay, because we're running out of time.
I'm going to speed it up.
You made some good points.
There's about 6,000 votes separated the Conservative Party majority on the federal government between a minority government and a majority government. 6,000 votes. So if any of your smart panelists can offer any advice on how we can get better organized, I'm listening.
That's great comments. One thing I would say is there's Adolph Reed, who is a friend and mentor of mine, has an article in the current issue of Harper's, which is about the U.S. left, which, you know, we'll probably read more as a warning to you Canadians, since you have, you know, 3 times the union density that we have, et cetera, et cetera. But I would refer people to that for some of these answers.
Okay, thanks. Gentleman on the left, my left here.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Just very quickly, it seems that there's a lot of angst, even by the panelists, that the enemy and the people that need to be convinced are the government. And you hear this, and it's not really. What the target needs to be your neighbor. Your target needs to be every single person in your community, not the politicians. The politicians will listen to the people, just as you've said over and over again. Don't go after the politicians. You've got to go after your neighbor. And as the gentleman before me spoke, it's organization on the ground. And you didn't get emancipation of slavery because somebody close to the president said, hey, I think we got to do this. You got it because public opinion, the dial moved and moved and moved and moved, and then it got to a point where the politicians acted. And that is the same in every single event you will ever see.
Thanks.
I just wanted to respond. I just want to make a quick plug to 3 organizations. You probably know about them, but the Dogwood Initiative, Lead Now. So Dogwood deals with on-the-ground organizing and for the environmental movement. Lead Now is doing a pro-democracy movement right now where they're organizing in communities and ridings across the country. And openmedia.ca, who deals with surveillance and privacy and issues of the open internet. All 3 of those organizations are doing incredible work in civic engagement and community organizing. And if you don't know them or support them already, then you should.
That's good. No, the final question, appropriately, is one of the fathers of the Agricultural Land Reserve. He's also featured in this week's Georgia Straight with an innovative idea for what to do with the Vancouver Police Station, and it's Bob Williams, who was the most powerful person probably in the Dave Barrett government.
Thanks, Charlie. You know, our state in British Columbia is seated south of the 49th parallel in Victoria, British Columbia. And that tells us a lot. And the challenge, I think, as Gen Y says, is how do we rethink the state? It has to change. The simplistic model we have isn't good enough. It has to be decentralized. We have a wonderful range of regions here. And when we do that, we will be democratizing this state. And we do need, essentially, to empower people to a greater degree. So we have to use the state, I would suggest, in order to destroy the state as it presently is. And that's a creative exercise. It's partly happening now with First Nations and everything that's evolving around those issues of the land claim. But the real issue is empowering people. And it means the left has to get off the dime in terms of seeing things much too narrowly. As the gentleman from the other newspaper suggested, those rednecks in Nebraska were onto something. They were offended by what this would all mean in terms of their little part of the state. And that is a kind of empowerment, too, that the left has to accept and get used to and celebrate. If we had more people like this gentleman speaking out in Hat Creek and everywhere else, we would be a democratized state if we empowered them at the decentralized level. That's the big opportunity in this province.
Thank you, Bob. He's not too old to run for re-election. Anyway, I want to close by thanking everyone. First of all, I want to thank Joe Hall, SFU, Vancity, which plays such an instrumental role in this series. I want to thank Kai Nagata for some very profound questions, and as you as well, Tara. And thanks on Skype, Melina. You were very patient, and we appreciated your input very much. And I just want to thank Christian Parenti, because he really sets the bar high for people in journalism with his intellectual curiosity and how he's able to assimilate disparate pieces of information to really help enlighten all of us. And I'm going to give another plug for his book, Tropic of Chaos. I've read it. I've reviewed it. It's excellent. So a final thanks to Christian.
Thanks to all of you who